The first gunshot was a crack of judgment sharp enough to split the noonday silence of Redemption Creek. It was followed by the sound of shattering glass, a crystalline scream that sent a flock of pigeons scattering into the bleached white sky. Dust, which had been sleeping peacefully on the main street, swirled in panicked eddies as townsfolk scrambled for cover. Jackson, standing by the farrier's forge with a new set of horseshoes in his hand, did not move. He simply turned his head, his gaze settling on the First Redemption Bank, its windows now gaping jagged mouths. Inside, chaos reigned. A man lay still behind the teller's counter, a crimson stain spreading across the clean white of his shirt. Another robber face, hidden by a grimy bandana, was stuffing wads of cash into a canvas sack, his hands trembling. But the architect of the violence stood calmly in the center of the room, his long duster coat unbuttoned, revealing twin holsters at his hips. He was a tall man, lean as a whip, with a face that was handsome, in a cruel, predatory way. His voice, when he spoke, was not the rough bark of a common outlaw, but articulate, laced with a mocking theatricality. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said, his voice carrying over the whimpers of the hostages cowering on the floor. "A transaction is a simple matter of exchange. You provide the capital, we provide the motivation to part with it." He smiled, a flash of white teeth that held no warmth. This was Silas Croft. Jackson watched from across the street, his expression unreadable. He was a man accustomed to the periphery, his silence a wall built brick by brick over years of quiet observation. The townsfolk knew him as the solitary rancher from the edge of the territories, a man of few words and fewer attachments, haunted by the ghost of his father, who had perished in a mining accident a generation ago. They saw an outsider, a man carved from the same hard earth he worked, and they kept their distance. Silas Croft stepped out onto the bank's boardwalk, the heavy sack slung over his shoulder. He took a deep breath of the dusty air, savoring his victory. The bank manager, a portly man named Abernathy, with sweat-slicked hair, stumbled out after him, pushed from behind by one of Silas's men. "Please," Abernathy begged, his voice cracking. "You have everything. Just leave us be." Silas turned, his smile vanishing. He looked down at the manager with an expression of profound disappointment, as if Abernathy had violated some unspoken rule of etiquette. "You misunderstand the nature of our business, Mr. Abernathy. This isn't just about money. It's about making a statement. It's about correcting a historical imbalance." Before Abernathy could process the words, Silas drew his pistol. The movement was a fluid, effortless arc. The hammer fell with a deafening roar. The manager collapsed, a neat, dark hole appearing in his forehead. A collective gasp rippled through the hidden watchers of Redemption Creek. Silas Croft holstered his weapon without a glance at the body, his attention already elsewhere. "Let that be a lesson in finality," he called out to the silent town. He motioned to his men, and they spurred their horses, thundering down the street in a cloud of alkali dust. As Silas swung onto his own horse, something slipped from his waistcoat pocket, catching the harsh sunlight as it fell. It was a small silver locket, and it landed in the thick dust of the street with a soft, unnoticed thud. The robbers vanished over the rise, their laughter trailing behind them like a curse. Slowly, cautiously, people emerged from doorways and alleys. Sheriff Miller, a man whose weary face was a roadmap of compromises and disappointments, was the first to reach Abernathy's body. He knelt, closed the dead man's eyes, and sighed the sound, carrying the weight of a town that had seen too much of this. Jackson's gaze was not on the body. It was fixed on the small, glinting object in the street. He walked forward, his boots crunching softly on the sun-baked earth. The townsfolk parted for him, their whispers following him. They watched as he crouched and picked up the silver locket, its surface warm from the sun. He turned it over in his calloused palm. It was old, intricately engraved, with a pattern of climbing ivy. His thumb found the clasp, It opened with a faint click. The world seemed to fall away. Inside, behind a cracked pane of glass, was a faded sepia portrait. It was a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her hair pinned up in a style popular 2 decades ago. Jackson's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful intake of air. It was a face he knew better than his own, a face he had only ever seen in a single treasured photograph on the mantelpiece of his desolate ranch house. It was his mother. The violent stranger who had just executed a man in cold blood carried a portrait of the woman who had given Jackson life. In that silent, sun-scorched moment, the robbery ceased to be a town matter. It became an intimate, terrifying mystery, and Jackson knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his quiet life was over. The sun hammered the cracked earth into a sheet of baked clay. The scorching air tasted of dust and the ghost of a distant rain that would never arrive. This was the world Jackson had carved his existence from, a secluded ranch nestled in the unforgiving embrace of the Badlands. It was a place of profound silence, where the only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the sparse cottonwoods and the steady rhythmic work of his own hands. The ranch was his inheritance, but so was the silence. It had settled over him the day they brought his father's body back from the Blackwood mine, crushed in a supposed cave-in, leaving a young Jackson with nothing but a legacy of quiet grief and the pitying glances of the townsfolk. He had grown into that silence, wearing it like a second skin. The people of Redemption Creek saw him as an enigma, a man content with the company of his horses and the ghosts of his past. Sheriff Miller was one of the few who treated him with a measure of respect. Miller was a man worn down by the endless friction between the law and the lawless frontier, his shoulders perpetually slumped under the weight of his tin star. He saw in Jackson a reflection of his own weariness, a man who understood that some battles were best left unfought. But the locket had changed everything. It burned in Jackson's pocket, a cold, heavy presence that felt more real than the familiar weight of the colt on his hip. He rode back to his ranch, not with the slow, measured pace of a man at peace with his solitude, but with a new urgent tension in his shoulders. The memory of his mother's face, nestled in a killer's locket, had dug up a grave he never knew existed. Back in his cabin, a simple structure of rough-hewn logs that smelled of pine sap and wood smoke, he placed the locket on the worn wooden table. He stared at it, the intricate ivy carvings seeming to mock him. His father had been a good man, a hard worker who believed in the promise of the earth. The official story was simple. A support beam in the Blackwood mine had given way, a tragic accident. But there had always been whispers, dark murmurs that died whenever young Jackson approached. Whispers of a dispute, of a partnership gone sour. Ghosts. Sheriff Miller had always warned him against digging up old ghosts. The next morning, he rode into town. Redemption Creek was a wounded animal licking its wounds. Abernathy's wife, draped in black, wept on the arm of the preacher. Men gathered in tight, angry knots outside the saloon, their voices low and vengeful. Jackson ignored them. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and ink. Miller sat behind his desk, rubbing his temples, a stack of paperwork before him. He looked up as Jackson entered, his eyes tired. "Jackson," he said, his voice gravelly, "if you're here to join the posse, you're too late." They rode out at dawn, full of whiskey and righteous anger. They'll be lucky if they don't shoot each other before they find Croft. Jackson didn't respond. He simply walked to the desk and placed the silver locket on a stack of wanted posters. His movements were concise, every gesture carrying weight. Silas Croft dropped this. Sheriff Miller's eyes fell to the locket. He froze. A flicker of recognition, or something closer to dread, crossed his face. He reached out a trembling hand and picked it up, his thumb tracing the ivy pattern. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. "Where did you say you found this?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp. I didn't say, Jackson replied, his tone low and even. He dropped it after he shot Abernathy. Miller looked from the locket to Jackson, his gaze intense. He saw not just a grieving son, but a man standing on the edge of a precipice. Jackson, some things are better left buried. This is one of them. Let it go. My mother's picture is inside, Jackson stated. It was not an accusation, but a simple, devastating fact. The sheriff's shoulders slumped further, the fight draining out of him. He let out a long, ragged breath. Your father. He wasn't always a solitary man. Before he met your mother, he had a partner, a man named Thomas Croft. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. They were chasing the same dream at the Blackwood mine. Miller continued, his eyes distant. But dreams on the frontier have a way of turning into nightmares. They had a falling out, a bad one. Croft left town vowing he'd be back to claim what was his. Not long after the cave-in happened, Jackson's voice was barely a whisper, rough and tight. And Silas? That would be Thomas's son. Last I heard, the boy was running with a bad crowd down south. Looks like he's come home to collect on his father's grudge. Miller leaned forward, his expression pleading. This isn't about a bank robbery, son. This is old blood, bad blood. You go after him, you're not just chasing an outlaw. You're digging up a war that should have stayed dead and buried with your father. Jackson picked up the locket, its silver cool against his skin. The sheriff's warning was clear, a locked door he was being told not to open. But inside him, something had already broken free. For years he had honored his father's memory with silence. Now he would honor it with answers. He was seen with a woman and a little girl. Jackson said his question direct and pointed. Dark hair. The girl's no older than 6. Miller sighed, recognizing the futility of his warning. He shuffled through a pile of papers. Got a report from a stagecoach driver. Saw Croft's gang making camp out by the old Cienega line shacks. Said there was a woman with them, looked like she was being held against her will. He didn't want any trouble, so he kept riding. Jackson nodded once the decision made. He turned and walked to the door, the locket clutched in his fist. Jackson, Miller called after him. This won't bring him back. It'll only get you buried alongside him. Jackson paused in the doorway, the bright, unforgiving sunlight framing his silhouette. He didn't turn around. Maybe, he said, his voice resonating with a grim finality that sent a shiver down the sheriff's spine. But I'm not going to die without knowing why. He stepped out into the sun, leaving the sheriff with his dark secrets and buried truths. Jackson's hunt had begun. It was no longer for the law or even for the town's stolen money. He was hunting for the truth of his own past, a truth that now had a name: Silas Croft. The Cienega line shacks were skeletal remains, bleached by the sun-forgotten relics of a cattle line that had gone bust a decade prior. The wind moaned through their collapsed roofs and panelless windows, a mournful sound that echoed the desolation of the landscape. Jackson approached with caution, dismounting a half-mile out and making the final approach on foot, his rifle held ready. The gang's camp was deserted, the embers of their fire cold and gray. Empty whiskey bottles and discarded food tins littered the ground, the leavings of men who took what they wanted from the world and left only trash in their wake. He found her in the most dilapidated of the shacks, a structure that was little more than a pile of rotting planks. She was huddled in a corner, her daughter clutched to her chest, trying to make herself small enough to disappear into the shadows. Jackson's first sight of her was of a pair of wide, terrified eyes, staring out from a face mapped with bruises. This was Geneva. Her dress was torn, her dark hair matted with dust and dried blood. But it was the look in her eyes that stopped him. It wasn't just fear. It was a profound, bone-deep terror, the look of an animal that has been hunted for so long it has forgotten what it feels like to not be prey. Her daughter Susan, a tiny thing with her mother's dark eyes, whimpered and buried her face deeper into Geneva's shoulder. "Stay back," Geneva rasped, her voice raw. She shuffled backward, pushing Susan behind her, her body tensing as if for a blow. "If he sent you to bring us back, you can tell him I'd rather die out here." Her words hit Jackson with the force of an unexpected punch. She thought he was one of them. He saw himself reflected in her terror, not a rescuer, but another threat, another man come to inflict pain. This was his first obstacle, a wall of trauma far more formidable than any armed outlaw. He stopped, holding his hands up slowly, palms open, keeping his rifle pointed at the ground. "My name is Jackson," he said, his voice low and steady, stripped of any threat. "I'm not with them. I'm tracking the man who leads them." Silas Croft. The name made her flinch, a violent, full-body shudder. Her mistrust did not waver. "Liar, you're one of his." Patience. He had learned it from the land, from the slow turning of the seasons. He couldn't force her trust. He would have to earn it moment by moment. He slowly unslung his canteen from his shoulder and set it on the dusty floor, sliding it gently across the space between them. "You're hurt," he said, "and the girl needs water." Geneva's eyes darted from his face to the canteen. The internal war was plain to see, her survival instinct battling against years of learned distrust. Susan's small, dry cough was the deciding factor. With a trembling hand, Geneva reached for the canteen. She uncapped it and gave the first precious sips to her daughter before allowing herself a drink, her throat working convulsively. Jackson watched in silence. He saw the angry welts on her arms, the split lip, the dark bruise blooming on her cheek. Silas had done this, or had allowed it to be done. He felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his gut, but he let none of it show on his face. Anger would only frighten her more. He backed away slowly and sat on the threshold of the shack, giving her space. He took out a piece of dried jerky from his saddlebag and set it beside the canteen, and then retreated, turning his back to her, to watch the horizon. It was a gesture of deliberate vulnerability, a quiet statement that he was not a threat. For a long time, the only sound was the wind. Then he heard the rustle of cloth as Geneva crept forward to retrieve the jerky. He heard her tear it into small pieces for Susan, followed by the soft sounds of the child eating. He didn't turn. He just waited. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and bruised purple. The desert air grew cool. Finally, her voice came from the shadows behind him, fragile but clear. He beat me because I tried to stop him from looking at her." She didn't need to say more. The unspoken horror of it hung in the air. "I told him Susan was sick. I made her lie still and pretend to be asleep. When he came near her, I fought him. He and his men, they thought it was a game." Jackson's hand tightened on the stock of his rifle. He remained facing away, his profile a hard line against the dying light. "Why did he have you in the first place?" "He found us on the road. Our wagon broke an axle. He said he'd help. He was charming at first. Said he knew this land, knew all its secrets." Her voice broke. "We were his prisoners. A diversion. Something to keep him entertained while he waited." "Waited for what?" Jackson asked, his voice quiet. "I don't know. He talked a lot. About history. About a debt that had to be paid in blood. He said he was coming back to Redemption Creek to reclaim what was stolen from his father." The words confirmed everything Sheriff Miller had said. This was a vendetta, and Geneva and her daughter were just collateral damage caught in a story that had begun before they were even born. He finally turned to face her. The last light of day softened the edges of her bruises, but it couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes. "They're gone now? You're safe." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Safe. We're in the middle of nowhere with a man we just met. Forgive me if I don't feel safe." Her defiance was a good sign. It was the first spark of the woman she was before Silas Croft had tried to extinguish her spirit. "My ranch is a day's ride from here," he offered. "You and the girl can stay there. No one will bother you." She studied his face, searching for the lie, for the hidden angle. She found none. All she saw was a quiet, weathered man whose eyes held a deep sadness she recognized as a distant cousin to her own. Why, she asked the question sharp. "Why are you helping us?" Jackson thought of the locket of his mother's face, of the father he was now beginning to realize he never truly knew. "Because Silas Croft has something that belongs to my family," he said, his voice raw with a truth he was only just beginning to understand. "And I'm going to get it back. Helping you is the first step." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was an honest one. And in that desolate, forgotten place, honesty was a currency more valuable than gold. Geneva looked at her daughter, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep, and then back at Jackson. She gave a slow, hesitant nod. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. The journey to Jackson's ranch was a silent pilgrimage. He rode slowly, his horse's gait measured to accommodate Geneva and Susan, who rode on Jackson's own steady mare. The town's reaction was immediate and venomous. As they passed through the main street, windows became frames for staring, judgmental faces. Whispers followed them like a swarm of angry hornets. "That's the woman Croft had," one hissed. "Look at her. Shameless." Another man leaning outside the saloon spat into the dust. "Jackson's lost his mind. Bringing that kind of trouble home." Geneva flinched, with every word pulling Susan closer, as if to shield her from the verbal blows. She tried to make herself smaller, to shrink away from the scorn that was heavier and more suffocating than the desert heat. Jackson said nothing. He kept his eyes fixed forward, his face an unreadable mask of stone, his silence a bulwark against their poison. He was used to their judgment. He had lived his entire life in its shadow. His ranch became their sanctuary. Geneva, driven by a desperate need to impose order on a life that had spiraled into chaos, began to clean. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, mended Jackson's worn shirts with meticulous stitches, and coaxed a small garden of herbs to life in the stubborn soil behind the cabin. Each act was a reclamation, a quiet defiance against the shame that had been forced upon her. She was not just cleaning a house. She was trying to scrub the stain of Silas Croft from her soul. Jackson gave her the space she needed, but his focus was elsewhere. At night, after Geneva and Susan were asleep, he would pull out a dusty, leather-bound trunk from beneath his father's old bed. Inside were his father's journals. For years he had left them untouched, relics of a grief he preferred to keep buried. Now he pored over them by the flickering light of an oil lamp, and the locket sitting on the table beside him like a silent sentinel. His father's handwriting was neat, the entries methodical. But as Jackson read deeper into the months leading up to the cave-in, and the script grew frantic, jagged. The name Croft appeared with increasing frequency. October 12th. Croft grows impatient. He speaks of the deed as if it is already his. He does not understand the patience this earth demands. He sees only the gold, not the spirit of the mountain. October 19th. He brought a surveyor from out of state. Questions about the structural integrity of the west shaft. He says it's for safety. I see the greed in his eyes. He is looking for a way to cut me out. November 3rd. Croft mentioned his boy today, Silas. Spoke of building an empire for him, a legacy. He stared at me when he said it, as if to say mine would be one of dust. The entries were cryptic, fragmented, but they painted a clear picture of a partnership crumbling under the weight of mistrust and greed. The final entry, dated the day before the accident, was almost illegible. The pencil lead dug so deep it had torn the page. He knows. God help me, he knows about the sealed shaft. He says we open it together or he exposes me. He leaves me no choice. The mountain will have to be the one to decide. The sealed shaft. Jackson felt a cold dread creep up his spine. What had his father hidden? What had he been so desperate to protect that he would risk a confrontation with a man like Thomas Croft? While Jackson wrestled with the ghosts in his father's journals, the living specter of Silas Croft began to haunt the outskirts of Redemption Creek. His terror was not random. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of messages intended only for Jackson. A homesteader on the North Ridge, a man who had once worked for Jackson's father, found his prize bull slain, a mining pickaxe, the emblem of the Blackwood mine, left standing in the dirt beside it. A week later, the old way station that marked the trail to the mine was burned to the ground. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. I am here. I know your history. And I am coming. The townsfolk, ignorant of the deeper meaning, saw only the work of a madman. Their fear curdled into anger, and that anger needed a target. They found one in Jackson and the woman he was sheltering. The whispers grew louder, more hostile. He was a magnet for trouble. He had brought this curse upon them. One evening, Sheriff Miller rode out to the ranch. He found Jackson sharpening an axe blade, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel filling the quiet air. They're getting restless, Jackson Miller said, dismounting. The town council is talking about running you out. They're scared. Scared people do stupid things. Silas isn't interested in the town, Jackson said, not looking up from his work. He's talking to me. And what's he saying? Jackson finally stopped wiping the blade clean. He looked at the sheriff, his eyes dark. He's telling me a story about my father. And I'm starting to think I've only ever known the ending. That night, as a storm gathered on the horizon, brewing a dry electric tension in the air, Geneva found Jackson staring at a faded map of the Blackwood mine spread out on the table. The journals were open beside it. She approached quietly, her presence a soft counterpoint to the storm building inside him. I haven't told you everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson looked up, his gaze holding hers. Silas kept me alive for a reason. She continued, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron. My father was a foreman at the Blackwood back when it was first being dug. I grew up in the miners' camp. I used to play in the tunnels as a girl. I know that mine better than anyone left alive. I know its secrets. She took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto his. This was the moment, the offering of the final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate act of trust. One night, Silas was drunk. He was talking to his men, bragging. He said they weren't after the gold. He said the real prize was in a sealed-off shaft, a place the official maps don't even show. He said his father was cheated out of it by his partner, a thief who took everything, and then buried him under half a mountain. The room was silent save for the distant rumble of thunder. Geneva's confession landed with the force of a lightning strike, illuminating everything. The journals, the attacks, the locket, it all snapped into a terrifyingly clear picture. This was never about a bank robbery. It was about a decades-old vendetta. Jackson's father hadn't been a simple victim. He had been a player in a deadly game, and he had hidden something in that mine worth killing for. Now the son of the man he had wronged was back, not just to reclaim a lost inheritance, but to utterly destroy Jackson's family name and everything he thought he knew. Silas wasn't hiding on the run. He was circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and his target was not the town's gold, but the very foundation of Jackson's life. The revelation settled over the cabin like a shroud. The world had been reshaped. Jackson's quest for truth had become a desperate defense of a legacy he now knew was built on a lie. He looked at Geneva, seeing not just a victim he had rescued, but a woman who held the key, the map to the very heart of the conflict. The days that followed were taut with a new kind of tension. Jackson's silence was no longer that of a quiet man. It was the focused, coiled silence of a predator. He spent hours methodically checking his rifle, cleaning and oiling each part until it moved with fluid lethality. His actions were his words, each precise movement a testament to his resolve. He was no longer just a rancher. He was preparing for war. Geneva, in turn, found her own way to fight the encroaching darkness. She began to draw. Using a piece of charcoal on a spare sheet of butcher paper, she sketched the hidden layout of the Blackwood mine from memory. The tunnels and shafts emerged on the page, a spiderweb of forgotten passages. It was an act of quiet courage, a way of taking the knowledge that had made her a prisoner and turning it into a weapon for the man who had given her sanctuary. But Silas was not a man to be kept waiting. He raised the stakes with a move of chilling audacity. He rode into Redemption Creek in broad daylight, not with his gang, but alone. He walked into the sheriff's office, and when he walked out, Sheriff Miller was with him, a pistol pressed to his temple. The town watched paralyzed with fear as Silas Croft forced their lawman onto a horse and rode out, disappearing into the hills. Left behind, pinned to the sheriff's door with a Bowie knife, was a note. It was addressed to Jackson. The script was elegant mocking. Jackson, your father and mine had unfinished business. I believe it's time our generation settled the account. The Blackwood mine. Sundown. Come alone. If you do not, the good sheriff will pay the price for your father's sins. And after him, the town. I trust you'll make the honorable choice. S.C. The town, leaderless and terrified, erupted. A mob led by the same men who had once taunted Jackson marched to his ranch. They carried torches and rifles, their faces twisted by panic and blame. This is your fault. Their spokesman yelled, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. You brought this curse on us. By sheltering that woman, you brought Croft's wrath down on us all. Jackson met them on his porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. Geneva and Susan stood behind him, framed in the doorway. He was truly alone, a pariah standing between a vengeful killer and the very people he was trying to protect. Get off my land, Jackson said, his voice dangerously low. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The quiet intensity in his eyes was more menacing than any threat. The mob faltered, their righteous anger suddenly seeming fragile in the face of his unbending resolve. They muttered, they cursed, but they held their ground, trapped between their fear of Silas and their fear of the man in front of them. Jackson looked past them, his gaze fixed on the distant, jagged peaks that hid the Blackwood mine. The sun was beginning to dip bleeding red across the horizon. He had no choice. He was being called to a reckoning, a showdown, not just for the sheriff's life or the town's safety, but for the soul of his father. He turned to Geneva, his eyes conveying everything he could not say. He handed her his spare pistol. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. She took the gun, her hand steady. Be careful, Jackson, she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she still couldn't name. He nodded once, and then stepped off the porch and walked toward his horse, the mob parting before him like water. He mounted and rode out, not looking back. He rode toward the Blackwood mine, toward a confrontation with a ghost from his father's past, the setting sun casting his long, solitary shadow behind him. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise as Jackson reached the foothills of the Blackwood Mountains. A storm was coming. Not rain, but wind. A great howling dust storm was rolling in from the plains, a churning wall of brown that promised to swallow the light and choke the very air from the sky. The wind was already rising, whipping grit into his face and moaning through the skeletal remains of the mine's old processing plant. The environment itself was becoming an antagonist. He tied his horse in a sheltered ravine and approached the mine entrance on foot, rifle in hand. The gaping maw of the main tunnel was a black wound in the mountainside. As he stepped inside, the wind howled behind him, the sound of the world being torn apart. The main chamber was vast, a man-made cavern supported by massive timber beams. Lanterns hung from the beams swayed violently in the drafts, casting frantic dancing shadows that made the darkness seem alive. In the center of the chamber, Silas Croft stood waiting. Sheriff Miller was on his knees, hands bound, a gun to his head. Jackson Silas greeted him, his voice echoing in the cavern, eerily calm above the rising shriek of the wind. Punctual. A finer quality than your father possessed. Let him go, Croft Jackson said, his voice flat. He kept his rifle aimed at Silas's chest. This is between you and me. Silas laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Oh, it is. It has been from the moment your father decided his ambition was worth more than my father's life. He gestured with his pistol toward a collapsed section of the cavern wall. Right there. That's where it happened. The accidental cave-in. Only it wasn't an accident. Your father, the sainted Abraham, rigged the support charges himself. He murdered my father to hide his greatest crime. The word struck Jackson like a physical blow, but he kept his face a mask of stone. Crime, Jackson echoed, playing for time, his eyes scanning the chamber, trying to reconcile its layout with Geneva's hand-drawn map. The deed, Jackson Silas's voice rose cracking with decades of inherited rage. This mine wasn't a partnership. It was my father's discovery. Your father was merely the foreman, a hired hand. But he found something down here, something my father never knew about. A rich, hidden vein of silver. So he forged a new deed, listing himself as sole owner, and filed it with the territorial office. When my father found out and confronted him, Abraham buried him under 10 tons of rock and played the part of the grieving survivor. The wind outside intensified, screaming like a banshee. Dust began to pour into the chamber, thick and suffocating. The lanterns swayed wildly, their light becoming unreliable, intermittent. I'm not here for money. Jackson Silas hissed, his face a contorted mask of fury in the strobing light. I'm here to reclaim my family's name, my honor, and I'll do it by destroying yours, starting with you. He was about to pull the trigger when Jackson spoke, his voice cutting through the gale. You're wrong. Silas paused, intrigued. Am I? My father wasn't a murderer, Jackson said, his gaze unwavering. And then he delivered the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, a truth he had only pieced together from the last frantic journal entry and the cold logic of survival. He was a coward. Silas stared at him, confused. He didn't die in that cave-in, and Jackson said the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He set the charges to block the tunnel to the silver vein to stop your father from getting to it. But he miscalculated. The whole section came down. Your father was trapped on one side, and mine was trapped on the other. But my father found a way out. An old ventilation shaft. He escaped and he ran. He let everyone believe he died a hero's death because he was too ashamed to admit he was a thief, too cowardly to face what he'd done. The secondary twist hung in the swirling dust between them, a truth more damning than murder. The man Jackson had mourned his entire life was not a hero, not even a killer. He was a fraud who had abandoned his own son to escape the consequences of his greed. For a moment, Silas was stunned into silence. The revelation shattered everything: his quest for vengeance, his narrative of a murdered father. His enemy was not the son of a monster, but the son of a pathetic coward. The righteous fire in his eyes flickered, replaced by a confused, hollow emptiness. That moment of hesitation was all Jackson needed. He dove for cover behind a massive pile of rubble as Silas, roaring in frustration, opened fire. The gunfight was not a duel of honor, but a desperate battle for survival in a storm-choked hell. Bullets ricocheted off the rock walls, the sound lost in the deafening shriek of the wind. The dust was so thick now that visibility was reduced to mere feet. The lanterns were extinguished one by one, plunging the chamber into near-total darkness, pierced only by the momentary flash of muzzle fire. Jackson's motivation was no longer revenge for a father he now despised. It was simpler, purer. It was for Geneva, for Susan, for a future he refused to let be buried in this tomb. He relied on Geneva's map etched into his memory. He knew about the secondary tunnel behind the rubble pile, the one that led to the old ventilation shafts. He scrambled through the darkness, his father's journals guiding his feet. He emerged from another tunnel behind Silas, who was still firing blindly into the dust cloud where Jackson had been. "Croft," Jackson yelled. Silas spun around, firing wildly. Jackson didn't fire back. He tackled Silas, sending them both crashing to the cavern floor. The fight was brutal, primal, a desperate struggle in the dark. It ended with Jackson's rifle pressed under Silas's chin. In the gloom, their faces inches apart, Silas gasped for breath, a broken man. "Kill me," he wheezed. "Finish it. It's what your father would have done." Jackson looked down at the man who had torn his world apart, the son of the man his father had wronged. He saw the cycle of violence of sins passed from father to son, and he saw a choice. He could pull the trigger, embracing the legacy of vengeance, or he could end it. With a grunt, he hauled Silas to his feet and slammed him against a support beam, disarming him. "The law can have you," Jackson said, his voice raw. "My father's legacy dies tonight. Mine begins." He was choosing justice over vengeance, breaking the chain. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent, and in the sudden ringing silence, Jackson's choice felt like the only sane sound in the world. As the first fragile light of dawn broke through the settling dust, the storm passed. A clean, quiet world was left in its wake. Jackson emerged from the mouth of the Blackwood mine, not as a conquering hero, but as a man who had survived a journey into his own soul and come out the other side. He led a captured Silas Croft, whose face was a blank mask of defeat, and supported a weary but grateful Sheriff Miller. He rode back into Redemption Creek in silence. The townspeople emerged from their homes, their faces pale with sleepless fear. They saw the captured outlaw, their freed sheriff, and the solitary man who had faced the storm alone. There were no cheers, only a stunned, respectful quiet. The mob that had threatened him with torches now looked at him with a mixture of awe and shame. Jackson didn't acknowledge them. He walked Silas directly to the town jail and locked him in a cell. Then he turned and faced the crowd. He didn't speak with bravado or anger. His gaze swept over them, and in his quiet dignity, they saw the reflection of their own panicked folly. He had done what they could not, and he had done it without their help. He went to his ranch. Geneva met him on the porch, the spare pistol still clutched in her hand. The question was in her eyes. He didn't offer a heroic tale. He simply told her the truth, every ugly, heartbreaking piece of it. He spoke of his father's theft, his cowardice, and the terrible legacy of the Croft family. He explained it all, not as a hero, but as a flawed man, finally untethered from the ghosts of his past, seeking to build an honest future on the rubble. When he finished, Geneva reached out and gently took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it held more acceptance and understanding than he had known in his entire life. In the days that followed, the town began to change. Sheriff Miller, his authority restored, made a public declaration from the steps of his office. He cleared Jackson's name, acknowledging his courage and the deep personal nature of the conflict. He told the town that Jackson had faced a private demon and in doing so had saved them all. The town's attitude shifted from suspicion to a deep, abiding respect. Silas Croft was taken away by federal marshals, a specter removed from their lives forever. Months later, as autumn painted the cottonwoods in strokes of gold, Jackson rode to the territorial office. He returned with the official deed to the Blackwood mine. It was rightfully his, the last vestige of his father's tainted legacy. That evening, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, he sat across from Geneva at the table. Susan slept peacefully in the other room. He placed the deed on the table and slid it toward her. With a pen, he struck out his father's name. Then, in clean, steady script, he wrote, "Jackson and Geneva." He signed his name, then handed the pen to her. "It's ours," he said, "equal partners." Tears welled in her eyes as she took the pen and signed her name beside his. This wasn't a gift. It was a foundation. Then Jackson did one last thing. He walked to the mantelpiece and took down the weathered, silver-framed portrait of his father. For a long moment he stared at the face of the stranger he had mourned for a lifetime. Then he removed the portrait and set the empty frame back on the mantel. It was a space for a new picture for a future. He would build himself a story that was yet to be written. He turned to Geneva, his heart open and raw. "My father left me a name I can't carry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you help me build a new one?" Her answer was not in words. It was in the radiant, tearful smile that transformed her face, washing away the last of the shadows. She stepped into his arms, and her acceptance punctuated by the sound of Susan's joyful laughter, drifting from the other room, was the confirmation of a new family. A family built not on the ghosts of the past, but on the solid ground of truth, resilience, and a partnership forged in fire.